The first thing they found was not a skull. It was a pocket watch. On a cold October morning in 1937, a sheep herder named Walter Briggs was moving his flock through a lonely stretch of foothills west of Riverton, Wyoming. Frost still clung to the yellow grass, and a hard wind swept down from the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The sheep drifted slowly across the slope while Briggs followed on horseback, collar turned up against the cold. One of the sheep wandered toward a shallow ravine. Briggs rode after it. That was when he noticed something pale among the sagebrush. At first he thought it was a sun-bleached branch. Then he saw another, and another. Bones. Human bones. The herder dismounted and approached carefully. Scattered across the rocky ground lay fragments of a skeleton. Time, weather, and scavengers had done their work. Most of the body was gone. Yet among the bones rested a tarnished silver pocket watch. Briggs picked it up. The watch no longer worked. Inside the cover was a simple engraving. Thomas E. Mercer. The name meant nothing to Briggs. Within a week, however, it would mean something to the sheriff's office. And within a month, it would become the first thread in a case that had remained hidden for years. 4 years earlier, in the spring of 1933, the American West looked very different. The Great Depression had settled over the country like a dust storm that refused to pass. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Men traveled hundreds of miles searching for work. Freight trains carried wanderers from town to town. Every road seemed filled with people who had lost something: jobs, farms, savings, or hope. Wyoming was no exception. Ranches struggled. Small towns survived on little more than cattle, sheep, and stubborn determination. In the valleys beneath the Wind River Range, snowmelt fed narrow rivers that wound through open grasslands. Cottonwood trees lined the watercourses, while endless stretches of sagebrush covered the hills. Not far from these lands lived a woman named Sarah Wolf Creek. She was 29 years old. Most people who knew her described her in nearly identical ways. Quiet, reliable, hardworking, easy to overlook. Sarah belonged to the Arapaho people and lived near the Wind River Reservation. Like many native families during that era, hers had experienced years of poverty. Opportunities were scarce. Seasonal work often meant the difference between having enough food for winter and going hungry. Sarah found employment at a small cattle ranch several miles outside town. The work was demanding. She cooked meals for ranch hands, washed clothes, cleaned equipment, occasionally helped tend livestock when extra labor was needed. The ranch owner appreciated her dedication. The workers barely noticed her. That suited Sarah perfectly. She preferred silence. While other employees gathered around card tables after supper, Sarah often walked alone beyond the ranch buildings. Sometimes she followed old game trails into the foothills. Sometimes she sat beside streams and watched the mountains darken beneath the evening sky. The land seemed endless there. Miles of open country stretched in every direction. A person could disappear among those hills. And sometimes people did. In the early 1930s, disappearances were not uncommon. A man would leave one town, seeking work in another. A drifter would hop a freight train and never return. A ranch hand might quit suddenly and head south. Families often lacked the money or resources to search for missing relatives. Many disappearances remain mysteries simply because nobody could afford to investigate them. Sarah understood this better than anyone. Among the ranch workers was a man named Earl Bennett. He had arrived in late summer of 1933. Tall and broad-shouldered, Bennett had spent years moving between ranches throughout Wyoming and Colorado. He worked hard enough when supervisors watched him. When they didn't, he became a different person. He drank heavily, started fights, bullied younger workers. Several men disliked him. Nobody challenged him for long. Sarah observed him quietly, day after day, week after week. She listened while he boasted. She watched how he treated others, how he laughed at people weaker than himself, how he enjoyed making others uncomfortable. Most workers avoided conflict with Bennett. Sarah never argued with him, never raised her voice, never showed anger. If anything, she appeared indifferent. That was what made her easy to underestimate. One evening, after supper, Bennett entered the cookhouse and found Sarah cleaning dishes. The room smelled of soap and coffee. A kerosene lamp flickered above the table. Outside, darkness had already settled across the ranch. "You always work this late?" Bennett asked. Sarah continued scrubbing a pan. "Sometimes. Don't you ever get lonely out here?" She shrugged. The conversation ended there. Bennett laughed and walked away. He never noticed the way Sarah watched him leave. Never noticed how carefully she observed everything. People, habits, routines, weaknesses. The same attention that made her an excellent worker would soon serve another purpose. A darker one. That autumn, wolves were becoming increasingly active in the foothills. Ranchers complained about livestock losses. Hunters reported tracks near several valleys. At night, their distant howls drifted across the open country. Most people regarded the animals as a nuisance. Sarah regarded them differently. She knew their movements, their trails, their feeding grounds. She knew which ravines they frequented and which slopes they crossed during migration seasons. Knowledge gained through years of walking the land. Knowledge nobody else considered important. Not yet. By November, the first snowstorms had begun sweeping across western Wyoming. The mountains vanished behind curtains of white. Roads became difficult. Travel slowed. Winter approached. And somewhere inside Sarah Wolf Creek, a decision was forming. Slowly, quietly, like ice spreading across still water. No one at the ranch could see it. No one suspected what she was considering. To them, she remained the same dependable woman who prepared meals and kept to herself. But Sarah had already begun imagining a future in which certain men simply disappeared. A future in which the vast wilderness swallowed every trace. A future in which no one would ever know the truth. And before the winter ended, that future would begin with a single death. Long before anyone would associate her name with missing men, Sarah Wolf Creek was simply another poor woman trying to survive the hardest years America had seen in decades. She had been born in 1904 on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. Her childhood was shaped by hardship. The old stories told by her grandparents spoke of a different world, a world before reservation boundaries, before government agents, before the constant struggle for work and food. By the time Sarah was old enough to understand those stories, much of that world had already disappeared. The reservation remained beautiful. Rolling plains stretched toward distant mountains. Rivers wound through cottonwood groves. In spring, wildflowers painted the grasslands with color. But beauty did not fill empty stomachs. Sarah's father worked whenever work could be found. Her mother sewed clothing, cooked, and helped neighboring families. Money was scarce. Some winters were especially difficult. Sarah learned early that survival depended on patience, observation, and endurance. She rarely complained, rarely cried, and rarely forgot anything. Teachers describe her as intelligent but distant. Other children often found her difficult to understand. She preferred solitude. Hours spent walking alone across the prairie suited her better than crowded gatherings. She paid attention to details others ignored. Animal tracks, weather patterns, the habits of birds, the hidden trails crossing the foothills. As she grew older, those habits remained. While many young people dreamed of leaving Wyoming, Sarah stayed. There were few opportunities elsewhere, and even fewer for a Native woman during the 1920s and 1930s. By the time the Great Depression arrived, work had become even harder to find. The small ranch that employed her provided stability. Not comfort, not wealth, just stability. For many people in 1933, that was enough. The ranch sat several miles from the nearest town. A cluster of buildings stood beside a narrow creek. There was a bunkhouse for workers, a barn, several sheds, and the cookhouse where Sarah spent much of her time. The days followed a predictable rhythm. Breakfast before sunrise, long hours of labor, dinner after dark, then sleep. Most workers came and went. A few stayed longer. One of them was Earl Bennett. Sarah noticed him immediately when he arrived. Not because he was unique, because he was familiar. She had known men like him her entire life. Men who mistook intimidation for strength. Men who enjoyed making others uncomfortable. Men who believed consequences belonged to other people. Bennett quickly became unpopular among the workers. Arguments followed him wherever he went. A card game turned into a fight. A disagreement over livestock became a shouting match. A drinking session ended with bruises. The ranch owner tolerated him because experienced laborers were difficult to replace, especially during cattle season. Sarah watched everything, never commenting, never intervening, just observing. One evening in late November, snow fell steadily outside the cookhouse windows. Most workers had already returned to the bunkhouse. Sarah remained behind, cleaning pots and preparing supplies for the next morning. The door opened. Earl Bennett stepped inside. The smell of whiskey entered before he did. He leaned against a table and grinned. "You work harder than anyone around here." Sarah continued washing dishes. "Maybe. You hardly ever talk." "I talk when necessary." Bennett laughed. "That's a strange way to live." Sarah said nothing. For several moments, only the sound of water filled the room. Then Bennett moved closer. Too close. Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath. His expression changed. The grin remained. The friendliness disappeared. For the first time, she saw something else in his eyes. Something she recognized immediately. Entitlement. Predatory confidence. The certainty that nobody would challenge him. Sarah stepped away. Bennett laughed again. "Relax." Without another word, she left the cookhouse. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the darkness. Behind her, Bennett called out something she chose not to hear. She walked toward her cabin without looking back. But that night, she slept very little. Winter settled heavily across Wyoming. Temperatures dropped. Snow covered the foothills. Coyotes and wolves moved closer to ranchlands in search of food. The nights grew longer, and Sarah's thoughts grew darker. At first, she told herself to ignore Bennett. Workers came and went. Eventually he would leave. The problem would solve itself. But weeks passed. Nothing changed. If anything, his behavior worsened. He bullied younger ranch hands, threatened one worker during an argument, started drinking more heavily. The ranch owner issued warnings. Bennett ignored them. The situation reminded Sarah of people from her past. Men who caused suffering while others looked away. Men protected by circumstance. Men who continued hurting people because nobody stopped them. The memory of old injustices returned. Some are personal. Others belong to family members. Stories carried through generations. Stories of violence, humiliation, and powerlessness. The anger she rarely expressed began accumulating quietly beneath the surface, like water behind a dam. One afternoon in January 1934, Sarah was gathering supplies from a storage shed when she overheard a conversation between Bennett and another worker. The details were disturbing. The casual cruelty in Bennett's voice was even worse. He spoke about people as if they were objects, as if weakness made someone deserving of suffering. Sarah remained hidden until the men left. Then she stood alone in the shed, listening to the wind outside. For a long time she did not move. Something inside her shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, more like a door closing, a final decision. Over the following weeks, Sarah began paying closer attention. She learned Bennett's routines. When he visited town, where he drank, which trails he preferred when hunting rabbits, what time he usually returned. No one noticed her observations. They seemed harmless, part of her quiet nature, the same habit she had displayed her entire life. Only Sarah knew they now served a different purpose. Late in February, a thaw briefly softened the landscape. Snow melted from lower elevations. Animal tracks appeared in muddy ground. One afternoon, Sarah took a familiar route through the foothills. The sky was gray. The air carried the scent of wet earth. Several miles from the ranch, she found what she was looking for. Fresh wolf tracks. A large pack. At least 7 animals. Perhaps more. The tracks crossed a narrow ravine sheltered from the wind. Sarah followed them for nearly half a mile. Eventually she stopped. The location was isolated, difficult to reach, rarely visited. She stood there silently, studying the terrain, the rocks, the brush, the game trails, every detail. When she finally turned back toward the ranch, her face revealed nothing. Yet for the first time, a plan existed. Not a vague thought, not an angry fantasy, a real plan, carefully forming piece by piece. That evening, the workers gathered in the bunkhouse while snow clouds returned to the mountains. Laughter echoed through the building. Cards slapped against wooden tables. Someone played a harmonica. Sarah passed by carrying supplies. Inside, Earl Bennett sat among the men, drinking coffee and telling exaggerated stories. He looked completely unaware, completely safe, completely certain of his future. Sarah glanced at him once, then continued walking. The wind howled across the dark Wyoming plains. Far away, beyond the ranch and beyond the roads, wolves moved through the foothills beneath the winter moon. And Sarah Wolf Creek had finally decided what she was going to do. March of 1934 arrived reluctantly. Winter still clung to Wyoming. Snow remained in the shadows of the foothills, while muddy roads cut through the valleys like scars across the landscape. The mountains stood silent beneath low clouds, and cold winds swept over the plains almost every afternoon. Life at the ranch continued as usual. Cattle needed attention. Fences required repairs. Workers came and went. Nothing appeared different. Yet for Sarah Wolf Creek, everything had changed. The decision she had made weeks earlier no longer felt distant. It had become a reality she carried with her every day. She did not think of herself as a murderer. Not yet. Instead, she convinced herself she was solving a problem that nobody else wanted to solve. That belief made it easier. Much easier. Earl Bennett remained exactly the kind of man she had come to despise. The ranch owner had already threatened to dismiss him twice. Several workers refused to drink with him anymore. One younger ranch hand avoided him completely after a confrontation that nearly became violent. Still, Bennett stayed. Still, nothing happened. And every day strengthened Sarah's conviction that no one else would ever stop him. The opportunity arrived unexpectedly. Late one afternoon, Bennett mentioned that he planned to spend the following Saturday hunting rabbits in the foothills west of the ranch. The area was remote. Few people traveled there during early spring. Most ranchers were too busy preparing for the coming season. Sarah listened quietly while he spoke. She already knew the region. She knew the ravines, the game trails, the rocky slopes. Most importantly, she knew where the wolves traveled. For several nights, she slept poorly. Not because she doubted herself, because she understood what would happen once the line was crossed. There would be no return, no way to undo it, no possibility of becoming the person she had been before. Yet each morning she woke with the same certainty. The plan would proceed. Saturday dawned cold and gray. Thin clouds covered the sky. A light wind moved across the foothills. Bennett left shortly after sunrise, carrying a rifle and a small canvas pack. Several workers saw him go. Nobody thought anything of it. Hunters often spend entire days in the hills. Sarah remained at the ranch until late morning. She performed her usual duties. Prepare meals. Clean supplies. Spoke little. Then she left, claiming she wanted to gather firewood from a nearby area. No one questioned her. Why would they? She had worked there for years. Trust came naturally. The foothills stretched endlessly beneath the cloudy sky. Sagebrush covered the slopes. Patches of old snow lingered among rocks and scattered pine trees. Sarah followed a route she knew well. She moved steadily and without hesitation. The land felt familiar beneath her boots. Hours passed. Eventually she found signs of Bennett. Fresh footprints. Rabbit tracks. Discarded cigarette butts. Broken branches. She continued following. The distance between them gradually closed. By early afternoon she spotted him. Bennett stood near a shallow draw overlooking a narrow valley. His attention remained fixed on movement in the brush below. He never noticed Sarah approaching. When he finally turned, surprise flashed across his face. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. "Walking." He laughed. "That's a long walk." Sarah shrugged. For several minutes they talked. The conversation seemed ordinary. Weather, hunting, work at the ranch. Nothing unusual. Nothing threatening. Bennett relaxed. Whatever suspicion he might have felt quickly disappeared. That was exactly what Sarah expected. The valley below them was empty. No roads. No houses. No witnesses. Only wind moving through dry grass. Sarah had imagined this moment many times. Reality felt strangely different. Quieter. Almost detached. As though she were observing someone else's life. When the moment came, it happened quickly. A sudden confrontation. A struggle. Confusion. Fear. Then silence. Complete silence. The wind continued blowing. The clouds continued moving overhead. The world itself appeared unchanged. Only one thing had changed. Earl Bennett would never leave the foothills. Sarah stood alone for a long time. Her breathing gradually slowed. She expected panic. Expected regret. Expected horror. Instead she felt numb. Not victorious. Not relieved. Simply numb. The reality of what she had done settled over her slowly. A human life had ended. And she had caused it. No explanation could erase that fact. No justification could change it. Yet, even as she recognized the truth, another realization followed. No one had seen what happened. No one knew. The remainder of the afternoon was spent covering her tracks. She worked carefully, patiently. using the same attention to detail that had defined her entire life. The isolated ravine she had chosen lay not far away. Reaching it required crossing rough terrain that discouraged most travelers. By sunset, the task was complete. The foothills had reclaimed their silence. Above the mountains, the sky turned orange and then purple. Night approached. Far away, the first distant howl echoed through the darkness. Then another, and another. Wolves. Sarah listened briefly, then began the long walk back toward the ranch. She returned after dark. The cookhouse lights still glowed. Several workers sat inside drinking coffee. One of them asked whether she had found enough firewood. She replied that she had. Another complained about the weather. Someone mentioned Bennett had not returned yet. Nobody seemed concerned. Not at first. Hunters occasionally stayed out late, especially if they became lost after sunset. The conversation moved on. Sarah joined them for a few minutes, then went to her cabin. That night she slept better than she had in weeks. The next morning Bennett was still missing. By afternoon, several workers organized a search. They explored nearby trails, checked hunting areas, questioned ranchers in neighboring districts. Nothing. No sign. No rifle. No tracks. No body. Nothing. A few days later the search ended. The sheriff took a report. Questions were asked. Theories emerged. Perhaps Bennett had left voluntarily. Perhaps he found work elsewhere. Perhaps he boarded a freight train heading south. During the Great Depression, such disappearances were common. There was little evidence suggesting anything else. Weeks became months. Months became a year. Eventually, most people stopped talking about Earl Bennett altogether. His bunk in the ranch house was given to another worker. His name disappeared from conversation. His life faded into memory. For everyone except Sarah. She remembered every detail, every step, every decision. And with each passing month, she became more convinced that she had committed the perfect crime. The vast Wyoming wilderness had hidden the truth. The wolves had erased what remained. No arrests followed. No accusations emerged. No one suspected her. That certainly changed something inside Sarah Wolf Creek. The fear she had carried after the killing slowly vanished. In its place grew a dangerous belief. A belief that she could do it again. And next time, she would be even more careful. The summer of 1934 was dry across much of Wyoming. Dust followed every vehicle that traveled the unpaved roads. Grass turned yellow beneath the relentless sun, and ranchers worried about water levels in streams and stock ponds. The Great Depression continued to squeeze every corner of the American West. Men still wandered from town to town looking for work. Freight trains still carried drifters across vast distances. And people still disappeared. Most of the time, nobody paid much attention. A man could leave one county and appear in another. He could find seasonal work, move south, change his name, or simply vanish into the endless movement of the era. Records were incomplete. Communication between distant communities was slow. Families often lacked the resources to search. Sarah Wolf Creek understood this reality better than most. She had spent months thinking about Earl Bennett, not because she regretted what had happened, because she was studying it, analyzing it, examining every detail. The search, the questions, the mistakes she might have made, the mistakes she had avoided. No suspicion had fallen upon her. No deputy had visited her cabin. No sheriff had asked difficult questions. As the months passed, the memory of fear faded. Confidence took its place. That confidence would prove dangerous. Autumn arrived. The cottonwoods along the rivers turned gold. Cold mornings returned to the foothills. Life at the ranch continued much as before. Workers came and went. Some stayed for weeks. Others stayed only days. One of those men was called Frank Dalton. At least that was the name he used. Nobody knew much about him. He arrived looking for temporary employment. Like many men during the Depression, he carried everything he owned in a single worn suitcase. Dalton was different from Bennett. He was not openly aggressive. He was cautious, watchful. Yet Sarah quickly noticed certain habits. He lied frequently. Small lies. Pointless lies. Stories that changed every time he told them. He also had a habit of stealing. Food disappeared. Tools vanished. Personal belongings occasionally went missing. Nothing significant enough to trigger a serious investigation, but enough to attract attention. The ranch owner eventually dismissed him. Dalton left without protest. Most people assumed they would never see him again. Sarah had other plans. Several days after his dismissal, She encountered him near a supply road west of town. The meeting appeared accidental. It was not. Sarah had learned where he was staying. A cheap boarding house near the rail line. She knew he hoped to find work elsewhere. And she knew he lacked money. Their conversation seemed harmless. She mentioned hearing about temporary labor available, an isolated sheep operation in the foothills. Good pay. Several weeks of work. Perhaps longer. Dalton showed immediate interest. People desperate for employment often believe what they want to believe. That was true in 1934. It remains true today. Sarah offered to show him the location. He accepted. The following morning they traveled together into the hills. The journey took several hours. As they moved farther from civilization, the landscape became increasingly remote. Rolling slopes, rocky ridges, dense stands of pine, narrow valleys untouched by roads. Dalton never seemed concerned. Why would he be? The woman walking beside him had spent years building a reputation for honesty and reliability. Few people inspired less suspicion than Sarah Wolf Creek. By late afternoon, Dalton disappeared. Officially, no crime occurred. No witnesses observed violence. No body was found. No report was filed. A dismissed ranch worker simply vanished from Wyoming. The event attracted little attention. Yet Sarah noticed something important. This disappearance generated even less interest than Bennett's. Far less. The realization strengthened her growing belief that certain people could disappear almost completely, especially during the Depression, especially if they were poor, especially if nobody powerful cared enough to look. Winter returned. Snowstorms swept across the state. Months passed. Sarah settled back into routine. Cooking, cleaning, working, waiting. Patience had always been one of her strengths. She never rushed, never acted impulsively. That patience led to another opportunity. In the spring of 1935, a traveling salesman named Harold Pierce began visiting ranches throughout the region. He sold inexpensive tools, household supplies, and various goods from the back of a truck. Most ranchers tolerated him because supplies could be difficult to obtain. Pierce traveled alone. He followed predictable routes, and he spent long periods on isolated roads. Sarah noticed him during several visits. She listened when he talked, asked occasional questions, learned details about his schedule. The information came easily. Many people enjoy talking about themselves. Harold Pierce was no exception. Weeks later, he disappeared. His truck was eventually found abandoned miles from the nearest town. At first, authorities suspected robbery. Then they considered an accident. Perhaps he had wandered away seeking help. Perhaps exposure had claimed his life. Search parties explored portions of the surrounding terrain. Nothing was discovered. The case stalled, like so many others. For Sarah, however, something had changed. 3 men had vanished. 3 investigations had failed. 3 times she had returned to ordinary life without consequences. The psychological barrier that had existed after Bennett's death was gone. Completely gone. She no longer spent sleepless nights questioning herself. The fear that once accompanied her actions had faded into familiarity. That transformation frightened no one because no one could see it. Outwardly, she remained the same quiet woman. Dependable, reserved, polite. Inside, a different person was emerging. One who viewed human lives through an increasingly detached lens. One who believed she controlled the fate of others. Yet perfection is an illusion. Every criminal eventually makes mistakes. Some mistakes are obvious. Others remain hidden for years before revealing themselves. Sarah did not know it, but the first cracks had already appeared. A ranch hand vaguely remembered seeing her speaking with Frank Dalton shortly before his disappearance. Another witness later recalled Harold Pierce mentioning a native woman who seemed unusually familiar with remote roads. Neither memory appeared significant at the time. Neither statement reached law enforcement. Not yet. But memories have a way of surviving. Sometimes they wait years before becoming important. Late in the autumn of 1935, Sarah stood alone on a ridge overlooking miles of empty country. The sun was setting behind distant mountains. Cold winds swept across the grasslands. Below, narrow valleys disappeared into shadow. The wilderness looked endless. Silent, unchanging. She believed it belonged to her. Believed it protected her. Believed it would continue hiding every secret she entrusted to it. Far below, a wolf pack moved through the gathering darkness. Sarah watched them until night covered the foothills. Then she turned and began walking back toward the ranch. Behind her, the land kept its silence. For now. By 1936, Sarah Wolf Creek had come to believe that she understood every weakness in the world around her. She understood the vast distances of Wyoming. She understood the limitations of local law enforcement. She understood how easily people disappeared during the Great Depression. Most importantly, she believed she understood herself. She considered herself patient, careful, methodical. Unlike many criminals, she never acted recklessly. Every move was calculated, every risk considered. That belief would eventually become her greatest weakness. Because the longer a person succeeds, the more difficult it becomes to imagine failure. The summer of 1936 brought unusually harsh weather. Long dry weeks were interrupted by sudden storms that rolled down from the mountains without warning. Ranchers watched the skies constantly. A clear morning could become a violent afternoon in a matter of hours. Sarah continued her routine at the ranch. To everyone around her, she remained unchanged. The quiet cook, the dependable worker, the woman who rarely spoke about herself. Yet beneath that ordinary appearance, her confidence had grown stronger than ever. 2 years had passed since Earl Bennett vanished. No arrests, no suspects, no evidence. The same pattern followed the disappearances of Frank Dalton and Harold Pierce. 3 men gone, 3 investigations that led nowhere. Sarah no longer feared discovery. Instead, she feared only one thing: losing control. In late August, a cattle buyer named Thomas Mercer began traveling through the region. Mercer was 43 years old and worked for a livestock company based in Colorado. His job required him to visit remote ranches, inspect cattle, negotiate prices, and move constantly between counties. Like many men who worked the western ranges, he spent much of his life alone. He carried a leather ledger book, a silver pocket watch, and enough cash to conduct business. People remembered him because he was professional and polite. He also followed a predictable schedule. Sarah noticed him during one of his visits to the ranch. Unlike some of her previous victims, Mercer had done nothing wrong. He was neither cruel nor dishonest. He simply fit a pattern Sarah had begun to see everywhere. A man traveling alone. A man whose disappearance could be explained by countless possibilities. A man who might vanish without immediate questions. The fact that he had committed no offense no longer mattered to her. That was perhaps the clear sign of how much she had changed. Over several weeks, she learned his route. Mercer regularly traveled through the foothills west of River. He often inspected cattle on isolated ranches where few people were present. The landscape provided countless places where someone could disappear. Sarah prepared carefully, as always. But this time circumstances would not cooperate. The day arrived in early October. The morning began clear and calm. By noon, however, dark clouds gathered over the mountains. A storm was approaching. Fast. Mercer was expected to travel through a remote section of foothills before reaching another ranch by evening. Sarah knew the route. She also knew she had limited time. The weather forced her to move more quickly than she preferred. As the afternoon progressed, strong winds swept across the hills. Dust rose from dry ground. Thunder echoed from distant ridges. The storm grew closer, and for the first time since her crimes began, Sarah felt pressure. Pressure leads to mistakes, even for careful people. By sunset, the storm had arrived. Rain hammered the foothills. Lightning flashed across the darkening sky. Visibility dropped dramatically. Sarah focused on completing what she believed necessary before conditions worsened further. The weather concealed sounds, erased tracks, created confusion. In some ways, it seemed ideal. But storms also create urgency, and urgency destroys precision. The work that followed was rushed. Not reckless, not careless, but rushed. A subtle difference, one that would later prove critical. As darkness fell, Sarah left the area convinced she had succeeded once again. The storm continued throughout much of the night. Heavy rain washed through ravines and creek beds. By morning, much of the landscape appeared transformed. She believed nature had erased every trace. For several months, it seemed she was right. Thomas Mercer disappeared. His employer reported him missing. Several ranchers recalled seeing him during his travels. Search efforts began, then gradually faded. No body was found. No witnesses emerged. No obvious evidence appeared. The case joined countless other unsolved disappearances of the era. Or so it seemed. Winter passed. Snow covered the foothills. Then spring arrived. Months turned into nearly a year. Sarah rarely thought about Mercer anymore. The disappearance appeared no different from the others. Another successful crime. Another secret buried beneath Wyoming's vast landscape. Then, in the autumn of 1937, everything changed. A pair of hunters entered a remote ravine while tracking deer. The location lay far from established roads. Most people never visited it. The hunters initially noticed nothing unusual. Then one of them spotted a piece of weathered leather protruding from beneath a cluster of rocks. Curious, he pulled it free. It was a wallet. Old, damaged by weather, but not completely destroyed. Inside remained fragments of identification papers, a livestock company receipt, several faded documents, and a partially legible name. Thomas E. Mercer. The discovery immediately attracted attention. Mercer had been missing for nearly a year. Finding personal property in such an isolated location raised questions. Important questions. Questions that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Deputies returned to the ravine. They searched more thoroughly. The area yielded additional discoveries. Fragments of clothing, buttons, small human bones scattered across the terrain. Evidence of scavenger activity. Evidence that a human body had once been there. The findings transformed a missing person case into something far more serious. For the first time, investigators began considering the possibility that Mercer had not simply disappeared. He had been killed. And if Mercer had been killed, what about the others? In the weeks that followed, older disappearance reports were reviewed. Names resurfaced. Earl Bennett, Frank Dalton, Harold Pierce. Different years, different circumstances. Yet certain similarities began to emerge. All had vanished in isolated areas. All had traveled alone shortly before disappearing. None had ever been located. The pattern remained incomplete, but existed. And once investigators noticed it, they could not ignore it. Far away, at the ranch, Sarah learned about the discovery through ordinary conversation. Workers discussed it over supper. Someone mentioned the recovered wallet. Another mentioned human remains. A third speculated about murder. Sarah listened quietly. No change appeared on her face. No visible reaction. Yet inside, something unfamiliar returned. A feeling she had not experienced for years. Fear. Not panic. Not yet. But fear. The kind that appears when a person realizes the past may not stay buried forever. The kind that appears when a single overlooked object begins pulling an entire hidden history into the light. For the first time since Earl Bennett vanished into the Wyoming foothills, Sarah Wolf Creek understood a dangerous truth. The wilderness had not erased everything. And somewhere, men she had never met were beginning to ask the right questions. The discovery of Thomas Mercer's wallet changed everything. Until then, the disappearance had been treated much like dozens of others that occurred during the Great Depression. Men came and went across the American West constantly. Some found work elsewhere. Some abandoned old lives. Some died in accidents that were never documented. But a wallet found beside human remains told a different story. Someone had not simply vanished. Someone had died. And somewhere in Wyoming, a killer might still be free. In October 1937, deputies from Fremont County returned to the ravine where the hunters had made their discovery. The search lasted several days. Men spread across the rocky slopes in organized lines. Every fragment of evidence was collected. Every unusual object was examined. The remains were incomplete. Years of weather, scavengers, and animal activity had scattered much of the skeleton across the surrounding terrain. Even so, investigators recovered enough material to draw important conclusions. The bones belonged to an adult male. The clothing fragments matched descriptions previously given by ranchers who had met Thomas Mercer before his disappearance. Most importantly, the location itself raised questions. The ravine was remote, difficult to reach accidentally. It was not a place someone would likely wander into without purpose. The evidence did not provide all the answers, but it suggested one possibility more strongly than any other. Mercer had died there. Sheriff Albert Hansen reviewed the findings personally. A veteran lawman in his 50s, Hansen had spent decades working throughout Wyoming. He understood how difficult investigations could become in remote areas. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses forgot details. Distances complicated every search. Yet something about the Mercer case bothered him. The more he examined the reports, the less it resembled an ordinary disappearance. One evening he sat in his office long after sunset, reading old files beneath the glow of an electric desk lamp. Stacks of paperwork surrounded him. Missing person reports, search records, witness statements, names, dates, locations. Most cases revealed nothing unusual. Then he noticed Earl Bennett, missing since 1934. Last seen near isolated foothills. No confirmed sightings afterward. No body recovered. The file was thin, only a few pages, but it attracted his attention. Soon afterward, he found another. Frank Dalton. Then another. Harold Pierce. Different occupations, different backgrounds, different years. Yet all had disappeared within a broad region of western Wyoming. And all had vanished alone. Hansen contacted neighboring jurisdictions. Telephones connected some offices. Letters carried information between others. Communication was slower than modern investigators would prefer, but it was sufficient. Gradually, additional reports arrived. Most proved unrelated. A few did not. Several missing men had disappeared under circumstances that seemed strangely similar. The pattern remained imperfect, yet continued growing. By late November, Hansen no longer believed he was dealing with coincidence. The possibility of a serial offender entered the investigation for the first time. The term serial killer was not commonly used in 1937. Law enforcement lacked many of the investigative tools that would exist decades later. There were no computerized databases, no DNA analysis, no advanced forensic laboratories. Investigators relied heavily upon interviews, records, physical evidence, and patience. Lots of patience. That reality forced Hansen to build the case piece by piece, like assembling a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. The first breakthrough came from geography. Maps were spread across a large table inside the sheriff's office. Locations connected to disappearances were marked with colored pins. Mercer's remains, Bennett's last known hunting area, Dalton's final movements, Pierce's abandoned truck. At first the marks appeared random. Then a pattern emerged, most clustered within the same general region. Remote foothills, ranch country, sparse population, large areas where crimes could remain hidden for years. The discovery was significant. Not proof, but significant. Someone familiar with the region could move through those areas with relative ease. Someone who understood the terrain. Someone local. As winter approached, investigators organized additional searches. The harsh Wyoming landscape complicated every effort. Snow-covered trails, wind-erased signs. Temperatures dropped sharply after sunset. Despite these challenges, search teams located several items connected to older disappearances. A rusted belt buckle believed to belong to Frank Dalton. Fragments of fabric matching descriptions from Harold Pierce's clothing. Scattered bones that appeared human. Nothing dramatic. Nothing conclusive. Yet every discovery pointed in the same direction. These men had not voluntarily abandoned their lives. Something had happened to them. Something permanent. Newspapers began reporting the investigation. Small-town publications printed short articles beneath cautious headlines. Missing men, cases re-examined. Human remains found in foothills. Sheriff reviews older disappearances. Most readers paid little attention. The nation remained focused on economic recovery, international tensions in Europe, local concerns. Yet within Wyoming, rumors spread quickly. Some residents believed a gang of robbers was responsible. Others suspected a drifter. A few blamed outlaws hiding in the mountains. Everyone had a theory. Almost everyone was wrong. At the ranch, Sarah Wolf Creek followed the news carefully. She never purchased newspapers herself. Instead, she listened. Workers discussed articles during meals. Travelers carried stories from neighboring towns. Ranch owners exchanged rumors. Every new development eventually reached her ears. Outwardly, she remained calm. Inwardly, she felt growing pressure. For years, she had controlled every variable. Now strangers were examining the past, searching places she had once considered safe, asking questions she could not predict. The uncertainty disturbed her, more than she cared to admit. One snowy evening in December, Sheriff Hansen received a report from a deputy who had spent weeks interviewing people connected to the missing men. Most of the information seemed routine. Then one statement caught his attention. A witness recalled seeing Thomas Mercer speaking with a native woman shortly before his disappearance. Another remembered a similar encounter involving Harold Pierce. Neither witness knew her name. Neither description was particularly detailed. Yet the similarities were difficult to ignore. The deputy added both statements to the growing file. Hansen read them twice, then a third time. The information alone proved nothing. Thousands of people fit the general description. Still, it represented the first potential human connection linking multiple victims. The first real lead. Outside, snow fell steadily across Wyoming. The mountains vanished behind white clouds. Roads disappeared beneath drifts. Winter tightened its grip on the state. But inside the sheriff's office, the investigation continued moving forward. A criminal case now existed. Evidence was accumulating. Patterns were emerging. Witnesses were being interviewed. And for the first time since Earl Bennett vanished nearly 4 years earlier, law enforcement was moving steadily toward the truth. Sarah Wolf Creek did not know it yet, but the distance between hunter and hunted was beginning to shrink. The winter of 1937 lingered well into the new year. Snow still covered portions of the foothills when Sheriff Albert Hansen expanded the investigation. What had begun as a review of several disappearances had evolved into something far larger. The growing case file now occupied an entire cabinet drawer in the sheriff's office. Reports, maps, witness statements, photographs, recovered personal belongings. The evidence remained largely circumstantial, but one fact had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Too many men had vanished in the same region under similar circumstances. Someone had to know more than they were saying. By January 1938, investigators shifted their focus from the victims to the people who had encountered them shortly before their disappearances. Deputies traveled across multiple counties. They visited ranches, boarding houses, general stores, rail depots, and roadside cafes. Dozens of interviews produced little value. Many witnesses remembered almost nothing. Years had passed. Memories faded. Details blurred. But persistence often succeeds where luck fails. Gradually, fragments began to emerge. A retired ranch hand near Riverton remembered Earl Bennett. The deputy questioning him expected little. Instead, the old worker recalled something unusual. Not about Bennett. About a woman. The ranch hand remembered seeing Bennett speaking with Sarah Wolf Creek several times during the weeks before he vanished. At the time, the observation seemed insignificant. Now it felt different. The deputy added the information to his notebook. One statement alone meant nothing. Still, it was worth recording. Several days later, another investigator interviewed a former boarding house owner who had rented a room to Frank Dalton in 1934. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Most of it proved useless. Then the woman casually mentioned that Dalton had once spoken about a native woman who claimed to know of ranch work available in the foothills. The description was vague, very vague, yet it sounded familiar. The investigator requested more details. Unfortunately, the woman could remember little else. Even so, the statement joined the growing collection of notes. The third breakthrough came unexpectedly. A ranch owner remembered cattle buyer Thomas Mercer. Mercer had visited shortly before disappearing. While discussing business, he had mentioned receiving directions from a local woman familiar with the region. Again, the description was limited. Again, it pointed toward a native woman. Again, investigators documented the information. Now 3 separate disappearances contained a similar element. Not proof. Not enough for an arrest, but enough to attract attention. Sheriff Hansen spread the witness reports across his desk. He read them repeatedly. 1 report might be coincidence. 2 reports might still be coincidence. 3 demanded attention. A pattern was beginning to take shape. The same broad description appeared near multiple victims. A woman. Native. Local. Familiar with isolated roads and foothill trails. Someone trusted enough to approach without suspicion. Someone who seemed ordinary. The sheriff circled several names connected to ranches and reservation communities. One of those names was Sarah Wolf Creek. At first, Sarah attracted little attention. She had no criminal record, no known history of violence, no reputation for trouble. In fact, nearly every person questioned described her positively. Quiet, dependable, respectful, hardworking. The descriptions appeared almost identical to many investigators. That made her seem less suspicious. To Hansen, it produced the opposite effect. People rarely described anyone so consistently. The image felt almost too perfect. More interviews followed. Deputies spoke with ranch workers who had known Sarah for years. Most defended her immediately. Several laughed when asked whether she might be connected to violence. The suggestion seemed absurd. Yet even supportive witnesses occasionally revealed useful information. One worker remembered Sarah spending long periods alone in the foothills. Another recalled her remarkable knowledge of local trails. A third mentioned that she often seemed to know where hunters, ranchers, and travelers planned to go. None of these facts were criminal. Together, however, they painted an increasingly detailed picture. Sarah knew the land better than almost anyone. Meanwhile, investigators continued searching old locations connected to the disappearances. The work remained difficult. Years had passed since some victims vanished. Weather and scavengers had destroyed much evidence. Still, additional discoveries slowly emerged. Fragments of clothing, personal items, scattered bones. Each finding strengthened the theory that multiple deaths had occurred. Each finding increased pressure on law enforcement to identify the person responsible. Sarah noticed the change. The rumors circulating through local communities had become more specific. People no longer discussed a mysterious outlaw or wandering criminal. Now they discussed suspects, possible suspects. The distinction mattered. For the first time, she sensed the investigation moving closer. Not close enough to expose her, but closer than before. She responded the only way she knew how. She became even more cautious, spoke less, traveled less frequently, avoided unnecessary attention. To outsiders, nothing seemed unusual. Inside, however, anxiety continued growing. In February, Hansen ordered a complete review of Sarah's known movements during the years connected to the disappearances. Deputies compared dates, work records, witness accounts, travel routes. Most of the information remained frustratingly incomplete. Rural record-keeping in the 1930s was rarely precise. Still, investigators identified several occasions when Sarah could have encountered the victims. Again, the evidence was circumstantial. Yet the pattern continued strengthening. Not weakening, strengthening. Then came a critical witness. A gas station owner outside Riverton remembered something others had forgotten. Years earlier, he had seen Thomas Mercer speaking with Sarah beside a fuel pump. At the time, the encounter seemed entirely ordinary. Only after reading newspaper reports did he connect the memory to the investigation. The statement was carefully documented. For the first time, investigators possessed a witness who could positively identify both a victim and Sarah together shortly before disappearance. The significance was enormous. Not enough for an arrest, but enough to justify deeper scrutiny. One evening, Hansen closed the thick case file and looked through his office window into the darkness. Snow drifted beneath the streetlights. The town was quiet. He thought about the missing man, about years of unanswered questions, about the woman whose name now appeared repeatedly throughout the investigation. The evidence remained incomplete, yet his instincts told him they were finally approaching the center of the mystery. For the first time, Sarah Wolf Creek was no longer merely a name and notebook. She was the primary person of interest, and somewhere beyond the snowy foothills of Wyoming, she was beginning to understand the same thing. The investigation was no longer searching for a ghost. It was searching for her. By the spring of 1938, Sarah Wolf Creek had become the central focus of the investigation. Officially, Sheriff Albert Hansen still lacked enough evidence to charge her with any crime. Suspicion alone could not support an arrest. Witnesses had placed her near some of the victims, but no one had seen violence. No confession existed. No direct physical evidence connected her to the disappearances. Yet the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The same name appeared repeatedly. The same woman. The same remote landscape. The same missing man. Hansen knew that if Sarah was responsible, she had spent years hiding her actions carefully. To prove anything, investigators would need patience. A great deal of patience. The sheriff assembled a small team of deputies and investigators. The operation remained discreet. In a rural community, rumors traveled quickly. If Sarah learned too much about the investigation, she might destroy evidence or disappear entirely. The deputies therefore proceeded quietly. They interviewed witnesses again, reviewed old reports, studied maps, examined every known connection between Sarah and the victims. Most importantly, they began observing her daily activities. Nothing about her behavior appeared suspicious. She continued working at the ranch. She cooked meals, performed chores, visited town occasionally, spoke politely with neighbors. To anyone watching casually, she seemed exactly what she had always appeared to be, a hardworking woman living a modest life. But investigators were no longer looking casually. Deputy Charles Monroe spent several weeks reviewing records connected to Thomas Mercer. The cattle buyer had traveled extensively before his disappearance. Most leads proved worthless. Then Monroe discovered something interesting. Mercer's silver pocket watch, the one found beside his remains, had originally been accompanied by a distinctive folding knife. The knife featured Mercer's initials engraved on the handle. Family members confirmed he carried it regularly. The item had never been recovered. At first, the details seemed minor. Years had passed. The knife could have been lost anywhere. Still, Monroe added the information to the case file. Every missing object mattered. Meanwhile, investigators continued speaking with people who knew Sarah. One interview produced an unexpected lead. A former ranch worker mentioned that Sarah maintained a small storage shed on an isolated section of property near the foothills. The structure was old and rarely used. Most people paid little attention to it. The deputy conducting the interview noted the location carefully. The information soon reached Sheriff Hansen. For the first time, investigators had a specific place connected exclusively to Sarah. A place that might contain evidence. Or nothing at all. There was only one way to find out. Obtaining legal authority took time. The sheriff needed more than suspicion before entering private property. He prepared affidavits, gathered witness statements, presented the available evidence to a judge. The process moved slowly, but eventually authorization was granted. The search would proceed, quietly, without advance warning. The deputies arrived shortly after sunrise. A cold wind swept across the plains as they approached the storage shed. The structure appeared ordinary. Weathered boards, a sagging roof, dust-covered windows. Nothing about it suggested secrets. Sarah was working at the ranch when the search began. She had no idea what was happening, at least not yet. Inside the shed, investigators initially found little of interest. Old tools, ropes, rusting equipment, boxes of supplies. The search continued for hours. Then one deputy noticed irregularities beneath a stack of wooden crates. The floorboards showed signs of disturbance. Recent disturbance, far more recent than the rest of the structure. The crates were removed. The boards lifted. Beneath them lay a concealed space. The discovery changed everything. Inside the hiding place were several objects wrapped in cloth and stored carefully. Not valuables, not money, something far more important. Personal belongings. A worn leather wallet, a pocket notebook, several pieces of jewelry, a belt buckle, and a folding knife engraved with the initials. T.M. Thomas E. Mercer. For several moments, nobody spoke. The significance was immediately obvious. Mercer's remains had already been recovered. His disappearance was known, and now one of his personal possessions had been found hidden beneath Sarah's shed. The case had taken a dramatic turn. The search expanded. Additional items were cataloged and photographed. Some appeared connected to other missing men. Investigators compared recovered property against older reports. Gradually, identifications emerged. The belt buckle likely belonged to Frank Dalton. A damaged cigarette case resembled one carried by Harold Pierce. The evidence remained subject to verification. Even so, the implications were devastating. For years, Sarah had avoided leaving direct links between herself and her victims. Now investigators possessed exactly that. Physical evidence, tangible evidence, evidence a jury could understand. Sheriff Hansen received the news that evening. The moment he examined the recovered items, he knew the investigation had crossed an important threshold. The case was no longer built solely upon patterns and witness statements. Now it contained objects belonging to missing men. Objects hidden on property associated with Sarah Wolf Creek. The next step became unavoidable. An arrest had to be made. Sarah sensed trouble before she learned the details. The atmosphere around town had changed. Certain conversations stopped when she approached. People looked at her differently. News traveled quickly in rural Wyoming, even incomplete news. By the following day, she realized investigators were closing in. For the first time in years, she considered leaving. The idea appeared briefly, then disappeared. Running would only confirm suspicion. Staying offered at least some hope. Perhaps the evidence would prove insufficient. Perhaps investigators were mistaken. Perhaps. But deep down, she already knew the truth. The careful life she had constructed over years was beginning to collapse. On a cold April morning in 1938, deputies arrived at the ranch. Workers stopped what they were doing. Conversations fell silent. Sarah stood outside the cookhouse as Sheriff Hansen approached. Neither spoke immediately. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, cattle shifted behind a fence. Then Hansen informed her that she was under arrest in connection with multiple homicide investigations. Sarah listened quietly. No surprise appeared on her face. No attempt to run. No resistance. Only a long silence. As deputies escorted her toward the waiting vehicle, ranch workers watched in disbelief. The quiet woman they had known for years was leaving in handcuffs. And for the first time since Earl Bennett vanished into the Wyoming foothills, Sarah Wolf Creek was no longer the hunter. She was the one being hunted. The arrest of Sarah Wolf Creek spread across Wyoming faster than Sheriff Hansen had expected. By the following morning, newspapers in Riverton, Casper, Cheyenne, and several smaller towns carried headlines about the case. Some reports were cautious. Others were sensational. Most focused on the same shocking detail. A quiet Arapaho woman had been arrested in connection with the disappearances of multiple men. For years, the victims had been little more than forgotten names in old files. Now their stories had returned to public attention. Families who had long since lost hope suddenly found themselves reading newspaper articles about investigations, evidence, and possible answers. For some, the news brought relief. For others, it reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Sarah was transported to the county jail under guard. The facility was small by modern standards. A brick building with narrow windows and steel-barred cells. She spent her first nights there in near silence. Deputies described her as calm, almost unusually calm. She asked few questions, made few requests, and revealed nothing about what investigators most wanted to know. The disappearances, the victims, the years of secrecy. Sheriff Hansen personally participated in several interviews. He hoped that once confronted with the evidence, Sarah might confess. Instead, she remained careful, measured. She denied responsibility, or simply declined to answer. The interviews produced little. The prosecution would need to rely on evidence rather than admissions. Over the following months, prosecutors assembled their case. The challenge was significant. Unlike many murder investigations, several victims' bodies had never been recovered intact. Years had passed since the earliest disappearances. Witness memories were imperfect. Physical evidence had deteriorated. The defense would undoubtedly emphasize these weaknesses. The prosecution therefore focused on establishing a pattern, a clear and convincing pattern. The evidence fell into several categories. First came the personal belongings recovered from Sarah's concealed storage space. Investigators presented the folding knife identified as Thomas Mercer's property. Mercer's family members confirmed the engraving and ownership. Additional witnesses identified other recovered items linked to Frank Dalton and Harold Pierce. The discovery of these possessions beneath Sarah's shed proved difficult to explain, especially because she had never reported finding them. Second came the witness testimony. One by one, witnesses took the stand. A gas station owner described seeing Sarah with Thomas Mercer shortly before his disappearance. Former ranch workers recalled her interactions with Earl Bennett. A boarding house owner testified regarding Frank Dalton's comments about a native woman who claimed to know of employment opportunities in remote areas. Individually, each testimony appeared limited. Together, they formed a powerful narrative. Again and again, Sarah appeared near men who later vanished. Third came the forensic evidence available during the era. The science of the 1930s lacked many modern capabilities. There was no DNA testing, no advanced forensic databases. Yet investigators still presented valuable findings. Experts testified that human remains recovered from the foothills were consistent with known victims. Clothing fragments matched descriptions provided years earlier. Personal effects discovered near remains helped establish identity. The evidence was imperfect, but it was substantial. The courtroom remained crowded throughout the proceedings. Residents from across the region attended. Journalists filled the press benches. Many people expected a dramatic defendant, a coal monster, a visibly dangerous individual. Instead, they saw Sarah Wolf Creek. Soft-spoken, reserved, unremarkable. Some observers struggled to reconcile her appearance with the accusations. Others found that contrast even more unsettling. The defense argued that the prosecution's case relied heavily on assumptions. They pointed out the lack of eyewitnesses. No one had observed a murder. No confession existed. The recovered belongings, they argued, could have been acquired in numerous ways. The defense insisted that coincidence and prejudice had transformed suspicion into accusation. For a time, their arguments appeared effective. Several jurors listened carefully. Questions remained. Doubts remained. The outcome was far from certain. Then came one of the most important moments of the trial. Deputy Charles Monroe testified regarding the hidden compartment beneath Sarah's storage shed. Photographs were introduced into evidence. Jurors examined images of the concealed space. They saw how carefully the items had been hidden. Not discarded, not forgotten. Hidden, protected, preserved. The distinction mattered. Prosecutors argued that innocent people do not secretly store personal belongings belonging to missing men. The argument resonated with many jurors. Sheriff Hansen testified near the end of the trial. He described the investigation from its earliest stages. The recovered remains, the witness interviews, the growing pattern linking victims to Sarah. Years of work were condensed into a single testimony. When he finished, the courtroom remained silent for several moments. The weight of the case had become impossible to ignore. Sarah herself eventually took the stand. The decision surprised many observers. For the first time, jurors heard her voice at length. She answered questions calmly, denied involvement, denied harming anyone, denied knowledge of how certain items reached the storage shed. Yet under cross-examination, several inconsistencies emerged. Small inconsistencies, not dramatic revelations, but enough to weaken her credibility. Prosecutors pressed relentlessly. The questioning lasted hours. By the end of the day, many courtroom observers sensed the momentum shifting. Closing arguments arrived in late autumn. The prosecution emphasized the totality of the evidence. The victims, the possessions, the concealment, the repeated connections, the pattern. Again and again, prosecutors returned to the same question. If Sarah Wolf Creek was innocent, how had so many missing men's belongings ended up hidden beneath her shed? The defense urged caution. They warned against convicting a woman based upon circumstantial evidence. They reminded jurors of the gaps in the investigation, the lack of direct witnesses, the passage of time, the uncertainty surrounding some remains. The arguments concluded. The evidence had been presented. Nothing remained except the verdict. The judge delivered final instructions. The jurors rose and departed for deliberations. The courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters rushed to telephones. Families waited anxiously. Deputies maintained order. Sarah sat quietly beside her attorneys. For the first time since her arrest, uncertainty appeared on her face. Not fear, not panic, uncertainty, because the decision now belonged to 12 strangers. And no amount of planning could control what happened next. As darkness settled outside the courthouse, the jury continued its deliberations. By morning, Wyoming would finally learn whether Sarah Wolf Creek would be judged guilty or innocent. The jury deliberated throughout the night. Inside the courthouse, lamps continued to burn long after most of the town had gone to sleep. Deputies moved quietly through the hallways. Reporters waited in nearby offices, hoping to be among the first to learn the outcome. Outside, a cold Wyoming wind swept through the streets. Winter was approaching once again. Nearly 4 years had passed since Earl Bennett disappeared into the foothills. Now the long investigation was finally approaching its conclusion. Shortly after 9 o'clock the following morning, word spread that the jury had reached a decision. People began arriving at the courthouse almost immediately. Farmers, ranch hands, store owners, journalists, curious residents. Many had followed the case for months. Others simply wanted to witness the end of one of the most unusual criminal trials in Wyoming's recent history. The courtroom filled quickly. Every seat was occupied. Several spectators were forced to stand along the walls. A heavy silence settled over the room as the judge entered. Then the jurors were escorted back to their places. Their faces revealed little. Sarah Wolf Creek sat beside her attorneys. She appeared tired. Weeks of testimony and months of uncertainty had left visible marks upon her. For the first time since the proceedings began, the calm confidence she had displayed seemed diminished. She stared forward without speaking. The foreman of the jury rose. The judge asked whether a verdict had been reached. The answer came immediately. "Yes, Your Honor." Every sound in the courtroom seemed to disappear. Even the reporters stopped writing. The foreman unfolded a sheet of paper. Then he read the decision. The jury found Sarah Wolf Creek guilty on multiple counts of murder. Several people in the courtroom lowered their heads. Others exchanged quiet glances. A few family members of the victims began to cry. Years of uncertainty had finally ended. Not perfectly, not completely. Some questions would never be answered. But the mystery itself was over. The law had reached its conclusion. Sarah showed almost no reaction. For several moments she remained completely still. Then she slowly closed her eyes. No outburst followed. No dramatic protest. No declaration of innocence. Nothing. Only silence. The same silence that had defined much of her life. The same silence that had hidden so many secrets. Several weeks later, the court reconvened for sentencing. By then, newspapers throughout the region had covered the case extensively. Journalists described it as one of the most significant criminal investigations in Wyoming during the Depression era. The details fascinated readers. The remote landscapes, the missing men, the years of mystery, the hidden evidence. And at the center of it all, the quiet woman few had ever suspected. The judge reviewed the findings. He spoke about the victims, the suffering endured by their families, the deliberate nature of the crimes, the years during which justice had remained out of reach. Then he imposed the sentence. Sarah Wolf Creek would spend the remainder of her life in prison. The sentence effectively ended any possibility of freedom. The victims' families responded in different ways. Some expressed relief. Others felt only sadness. No verdict could return lost fathers, brothers, or sons. No sentence could restore the years that had been taken. For many relatives, the judgment brought closure rather than satisfaction. At least they finally knew what had happened. At least the uncertainty was over. Sheriff Albert Hansen returned to ordinary police work shortly after the trial concluded. Friends congratulated him on solving the case. Newspapers praised the investigation. Yet Hansen himself viewed the matter differently. He understood how close the crimes had come to remaining unsolved forever. Without the discovery of Thomas Mercer's wallet, the truth might never have emerged. The victims could have remained missing persons. The evidence might have stayed buried beneath the Wyoming soil. Sometimes justice depended upon skill. Sometimes it depended upon persistence. And sometimes it depended upon a single fortunate discovery. Historians would later note that the crimes occurred during a unique period in American history. The Great Depression created conditions that made disappearances difficult to investigate. People moved constantly in search of work. Records were incomplete. Communication between distant communities was often slow. Law enforcement agencies possessed limited resources. In such an environment, individuals could vanish more easily than in later decades. The vast landscapes of the American West only increased those difficulties. Miles of wilderness separated towns. Mountains, ravines, and open plains concealed countless secrets. For years, those realities had protected Sarah Wolf Creek, until they no longer could. As time passed, public attention gradually shifted elsewhere. New stories replaced old headlines. New events filled newspaper pages. The nation continued changing. Yet the case remained part of local memory. People remembered the missing men. They remembered the investigation. And they remembered the woman at the center of it all. Not as a monster from legend. Not as something supernatural. But as a real person whose choices had destroyed lives. A person who had hidden behind an ordinary face for years. One late autumn evening, long after the trial had ended, a shepherd crossed the same foothills where Thomas Mercer's remains had first been discovered. The sky glowed orange above the distant mountains. Cold air drifted through the sagebrush. The landscape looked much as it always had. Quiet, vast, indifferent. The wind moved across the empty ridges. No voices remained there. No mysteries. No missing men. Only the land itself. For years it had concealed the truth. Now it held only memories. And as darkness settled over the Wyoming foothills, the last chapter of Sarah Wolf Creek's story finally came to an end.